2023 was a grim year in the legislature for progress on climate change. Lawmakers passed very few bills, and those that did get through fell under the veto pen of Democratic Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham. This week, our Land senior producer Laura Paskus got together with leaders of 3 nonprofits for a conversation about what went wrong and why. They also talked about why climate change never seems to rise to the top of the political agenda, even in a state where the public clearly wants politicians to move on climate change.
We are here today to talk about climate change and politics. We've got Julia Bernal, Executive Director of the Pueblo Action Alliance, Camilla Feibelman, with the Director of the Rio Grande chapter of the Sierra Club, and Eric Schlenker-Goodrich, Executive Director of the Western Environmental Law Center. Welcome.
Thank
Hi.
you.
So it seemed like there was momentum on climate change ahead of the legislative session this year, but it ended up being another really disappointing year for climate action in the New Mexico legislature. In a nutshell, Camilla, what went wrong this year?
Well, it's similar to what's gone wrong the last 3 years in a row that we've tried to bring comprehensive climate legislation. We were presented with a drastically weakened bill by the governor's office at the beginning of the session, asked to support it, and offered some stronger ways forward, but were told that there wouldn't be a bill if we weren't going to support the one that was there. So we took a different path of trying to push forward 5 different climate tax credits that were to the credit of House and Senate leadership included in the comprehensive tax package, and then were part of a big line item veto in that bill by the governor, and that amounts to 0 action on climate in this legislative session, even though there was good news in many other realms, even in the environment, just not on the climate.
Yeah, so I'm interested in kind of what are some of those behind the scenes conversations that happen leading up to this session? Who's talking, who's making these things happen or not happen?
I think one way to think about it is over the course of the governor's leadership overall in her first term and now into her second term. I think in the first term, she did exercise leadership in terms of promulgating, pioneering methane rules, both through the Oil Conservation Division and the New Mexico Environment Department. She also passed the Energy Transition Act, which is helping in the San Juan Basin, both to retire coal-fired power, but then to also put money on the ground for communities to transition away from their dependency on fossil fuels. I think one of the things that we are thinking about at the Western Environmental Law Center is what is the governor's agenda on climate in her second term, and does she even have one? I think there's a sense that she checked the box on the methane rules, she checked the box on the Energy Transition Act, and she in fact doesn't have an agenda on climate action for her second term. And when I think about what the reason is for that, I think it's the entrenched power of the oil and gas industry and an unwillingness of state political leadership, starting with the governor, to truly challenge that power and to position New Mexico for the future, to really open new doors for a thriving, resilient future that isn't contingent on the volatility of oil and gas revenue, which ultimately is going to go away.
Right, so let's talk about that a little bit, because the fact that we are an energy producing state and we're seeing impacts of climate change, how do we decouple oil and gas from our economy? How do we rectify these two parts of us, Julia?
Well, I thank you, Eric, for what you had to say. I feel like there, in a sense, like I feel like she does have an agenda where it's based on supporting fossil fuels still and utilizing what are called, market-based mechanisms to allow the continuation of fossil fuel industries. So appeasing to that constituency in New Mexico, because of course we all know that New Mexico is very and severely addicted to fossil fuel revenues. But I feel like a lot of what grassroots, frontline, indigenous youth organizations are really looking to is how do we diversify our economy? How can we also stimulate the economy? Is that through like community solar grid projects? Is that by creating economies around remediation and care? I think that there's a lot of thinking behind what a truly equitable, just transition could look like, but it's not going to be a solution that is going to appease oil and gas industry or extractivism in general. Right. So that's, I think the duality of this issue is that we all recognize that New Mexico is in severe need of just transition, but we can't do that while also bolstering the fossil fuel economy.
And if I may, what Julia says also reminds me that, in fact, maybe there is an agenda, and part of that agenda is fossil gas, hydrogen. It's interesting that on Friday, after the session, she vetoed the 5 tax credits, and then on the Monday, the next business day, that she then submitted through her agencies a $1.25 billion hydrogen hub proposal that very much was grounded in fossil gas hydrogen. And the way at least we think about hydrogen, and I suspect Julia echoes this, is that is a way to perpetuate our dependency on oil and gas, not a way for us to transition away from that dependency, and not a way to truly address climate action in support of frontline communities.
Right. So I feel like, especially after a year like 2022, that was hard on many New Mexicans in climate-related ways. People are sad, people are overwhelmed, they want to do something. And I hear from people a lot who are worried about climate change. And I often say to them, talk to your elected officials. Make sure your elected officials know that you care about climate, energy, water. And yet here we are in a state where we're not like Texas or Florida. Our elected officials understand climate change, understand why it's happening, and yet it seems to me like Democrats will not deliver on climate action. What are the roadblocks? What are the barriers to this? Julia, do you have a sense?
Well, I think that and this is speaking from like a young person that hasn't been in this work as long as like Camilla or Eric, and in theory, democracy and democratic process is like, participation and like having the ability to talk to your political leaders and like see the debate out in the legislature. But what we're seeing is that a lot of these debates and topics are really dependent on relationships that people have, whether that's with the governor, whether that's with organizations and their political leaders or legislatures. And that, I feel, is also a deterrent for like forwarding like real climate action and real progress, because there's a lot of political capital that I think a lot of folks are really trying to protect, which, sure, I understand that like having relationships with people is a mechanism to like, see your agenda go through the legislature. But like, let's have the debate. Let's like see how democracy is supposed to work without, getting in the way of personalities or relationships.
Camilla.
Well, I'll just add a little bit. I think after the governor vetoed those 5 tax credits, you saw an outpouring of grassroots community concern onto the opinion pages, full pages of letters to the editor asking why, in a year like last year, where we saw massive fires at one point in every county in the state, generational homes burned, flooding as an after consequence. If we do not do something now, we are talking about agricultural collapse. We are talking about skyrocketing food prices. We are talking about leaving our kids an uninhabitable landscape. And I think that there was a calculation this year in the governor's office that she could cut the budget by cutting progress on climate through the tax package. And I think the clear answer from our grassroots all around the state is that will not work. When it comes to those relationships, what we are doing is asking our members to reach out in a very personal way to their legislators. We made some good progress in the legislature on banning the transport of high-level nuclear waste here, finally getting a permanent fund for conservation efforts. And I think legislators more than ever are hearing from their constituents saying, you've got to do something hard. We did voting rights, we did gender affirming and abortion care. But when you're standing up against the well-moneyed oil and gas industry, it's going to be that much harder. But there is not a single dollar that comes into this state that can justify a kid's asthma attack, the health care that people have to get because of the impacts not just of climate and on health. And we will work harder than ever, as we always have, a bit of Cassandra, calling on people to address this crisis. But we will keep doing that, and we will do it until we do something different. But it's going to require a transformational approach. We are going to have to leave oil and gas. We are going to have to say goodbye. And I think it's worth recognizing that no matter how well or poorly oil and gas are doing, it doesn't seem to change how well New Mexicans are doing.
Right.
Those jobs are dangerous. People get burned and scarred from doing those jobs, and so does our planet. So we have got to just keep coming back. As disappointing as it might be, as scary as it might be, our kids deserve that we do not quit.
I agree with you, and I don't understand how the potential for sort of planetary destruction doesn't rise to the top of people's political agendas. But it just feels to me like something needs to change, because I started covering the environment in the Richardson administration, and we went through 8 years of a Republican governor where bills weren't going to get introduced because she wasn't going to sign them. I feel like what really needs to change and how we're approaching this. Eric.
I think there's a policy answer and there's a non-policy answer. The non-policy answer, I think, is what Julia was talking about in terms of relationships. I think one thing we're all thinking about is how do we build solidarity and power in the progressive sector, and so that it's not viewed as a stovepiped issue, but as an issue that's really about the future of New Mexico overall. This is the moment for us to act. What Governor Lujan Grisham does now, what the legislature does now in the coming year or two, will dictate what New Mexico's future is 10 years from now, 20 years from now. That's going to be contingent on groups like ours organizing to counter the power of the oil and gas industry. Oil and gas industry provides a huge amount of money to politicians. It also provides a huge amount of revenue to the state coffers. And it is also the relationship that most political leaders are used to and comfortable with, listening to the oil and gas industry, not listening to the people. So I think that is something that really needs to change. From a more policy technocratic perspective, it is really transitioning away from our dependency on fossil fuel revenue while concurrently providing support for communities across the state, especially in those oil and gas producing regions, to be able to retrain their workers and move forward. I think thinking back about this session, that's one of the most frustrating things, because there were bills to start building out a geothermal industry in New Mexico that would be very consistent and supported by the conservation community and the climate community to help make that transition, build new industries, and we saw those bills and those tax credits also vetoed. So I think right now what we're seeing is the governor essentially not leading, including at the legislature, and passing up what is otherwise an amazing opportunity to set the stage for New Mexico's future. That's just not happening right now.
Julia, you talked about relationships, and kind of, the way I was thinking about it is sort of the backroom deals between lobbyists and lawmakers. I want to talk about the other kinds of relationships that we need to be building to be addressing climate change mitigation and adaptation. What are those types of relationships?
Yeah, so we're Pueblo Action Alliance, we're an Indigenous Pueblo organization, and so a lot of our campaign development and programs within our organization are really rooted in our values as Pueblo Indigenous people. A lot of those values are also these relationships that we have with the natural world and with our communities. And, in this bigger global conversation around climate mitigation and adaptation, it has been stated numerous times that Indigenous traditional knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge is going to be a mechanism to, getting to those climate goals. And a lot of what Indigenous groups across the world are trying to do is center that analysis, because ultimately, if you're doing that, you're then starting to look at, you're starting to look at the world differently, not as a resource, but as an entity, as a living entity. That relationship that we have with the natural world is really a part of our analysis as climate activists or climate advocates, whatever we call ourselves. And I feel like that concept isn't always as intuitive, to non-Indigenous people, and may even seem a bit like nebulous or not grounded in anything that can be action oriented, but ultimately it is, and I think that's been a big challenge in participating in a legislature, because ultimately a lot of the times when we're talking about water, land, resources, we're talking about them as materials rather than not like beings than our relatives. And ultimately it's just a challenge that we're constantly having to face. But again, I just want to say that it is going to be very vital for the future to center those types of concepts and ideologies.
Right. So you all are with different organizations, have different strategies and campaigns, but I'd like for each of you just to, very briefly, what is the one mistake you think New Mexico cannot make right now?
Doing what we're doing right now, we really need a clear, comprehensive plan. 60% of the greenhouse gas emissions that we are emitting as a state come from oil and gas and industry. So we need to know that operating oil facilities are complying with the strongest rules. We need to know those are working, and we need to do more if they're not. And ultimately, we need to keep it in the ground, or we will not create the future we need. But we also have huge emissions.
You get one.
Oh, what about the cars, the buildings, the fossil fueled hydrogen? There's so much to do.
It's so overwhelming. One thing we can't afford to not do right now.
We have a wealth of resources at the table in New Mexico in terms of state revenue. We have to make sure that state revenue is directed to good things, not to bad things. In other words, don't direct that towards fossil gas, hydrogen, direct that towards communities, direct that to the build out of clean energy infrastructure like geothermal, like wind, like sun, and make use of that opportunity. And I think what's key here is create a sense of belonging amongst the people of New Mexico. Oil and gas industry should not dictate our energy future. The people should dictate our energy future.
Julia, one thing.
Yeah, Eric kind of, that's going to
stole your thunder.
transition into what I was going to say. I'll just add quickly that, New Mexico is really unique in its diversity of traditional land-based people, whether that's indigenous people, Acequia communities, and those type of community models around land and water stewardship are really going to be important for climate adaptation. And so it would be a huge mistake if those ideas and those models were ignored by the state.
All right, thank you all so much for being here today. I appreciate it.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.